Good afternoon, Year 10. I'm going to carry on with our hormones topic today, talking about the menstrual cycle and puberty. So obviously this is a very applicable topic, it's quite an interesting topic with quite a few hormones involved. In fact, we're going to learn about 5 hormones today. So there's a lot to go through today. 4 questions on the board for a starter. You get those down in your books, just the answers, not the questions. So pause me and do those. Right, so the first question is, what is the function of glucagon? And we said glucagon last week. We said that it causes glycogen to be broken down into glucose when you have too low blood sugar in order to raise your blood sugar. What does TSH do, and what will be the effects of this? TSH causes thyroxine to be released from the thyroid gland. And the effects of that will be an increase in basal metabolic rate and increase in respiration. What gland releases adrenaline? Well, that is the adrenal gland. And where is it found? On top of the kidneys. What causes type 1 diabetes? Well, that is a genetic issue. It's down to not enough insulin being created from your pancreas. And how can it be treated? That can be treated with insulin injections, is the easiest way. You also have to control your diet and do enough exercise. Fine, so today we're going to go through the menstrual cycle and puberty. Now, ignore those numbers there. So we're going to be looking at something fairly much around a level 8 if you can get to the top of these levels. Now, explain the function of several key named hormones in the menstrual cycle. That is the most difficult thing we're going to do today. I'm going to go through the menstrual cycle in a lot of detail. Now, if I taught you the menstrual cycle when you were in year 7, you will already have done some of this. But most of you will not. Describe in detail the main stages of the menstrual cycle. Again, that's not too difficult. And state what the menstrual cycle is. I'm going to add on to this lesson, just to kind of get it out of the way almost, just a few slides on puberty and understanding what causes puberty. Fine, we're actually going to start with puberty. It's literally 3 or 4 slides, just to move on from that. Now, the first thing is, I'm not going to insult you by trying to teach you what happens in your bodies during puberty. I think everyone remembers that from year 7, but I do need to make sure that you remember that. So, I'm going to give you a table there. I'd like you, from your own knowledge, to fill that in. We'll go through the answers of that, and then that's all the teacher going to do on the changes that happen during puberty. So you want to fill it in with what changes in boys from before puberty to after puberty, what changes in girls, and what changes in both. So you have, with drawing of the table, 3 or 4 minutes for this. Fine. So, changes in boys. Now, we're looking at things like increased shoulder width. We're talking about penis enlargement. We're talking about testicle enlargement. We're talking about large amounts of body hair growth and facial hair growth. Now, it's important to understand that both men and women do have body hair growth, but it's larger in men. Then you're going to be looking at a voice breaking, so Adam's apple formation, increased musculature. Can I think of anything else off the top of my head? I probably missed 1 or 2, but those ones will do you just fine. Changes in girls, you've got breast formation, you've got menstrual cycle, you've got increasing width of hips, you've got slight deepening in voice, but not large amounts, so it's not called voice breaking. You also have body hair growth there. We'll come to changes in both in a minute. And that will do me for now as well, I think. Changes in both. You are looking at increased height. So both of them gain increased height and therefore increased weight, but that's just as a product of increased height. Talking about body hair growth, both of them do grow hair on their bodies. And do anything else? Oh, emotional changes, of course. Becoming attracted to the opposite sex, that kind of an idea. So that will do just fine. Now, you're only going to be asked for 1 or 2 of these in a test, and in all honesty, it never comes up just because of how obvious it is. But technically, we have to go through it, so we just have. Fine. Now, the one thing we might not know, the one term you might not know, is this term secondary sexual characteristic. So each of those changes there causes a secondary sexual characteristic. So you were talking about something like increased shoulder width. That is a secondary sexual characteristic. Now, broadly, a secondary sexual characteristic is something that can be used to tell the sexes apart, to tell male from female, which is not entirely necessary for being male or female. So the primary sexual characteristic is having a penis or having a vagina. That is the primary sexual characteristic. The others are secondary. So having breasts is a secondary sexual characteristic of women. Having a deep voice is a secondary sexual characteristic in men. We need to know that term. We need to know that secondary sexual characteristics occur during puberty. And we need to then be able to talk about the two hormones that cause that, which we'll go on to in the next slide. So can you please take down those notes? Pause me if you haven't been writing while I've been talking, and we will get going. Next slide. So, once you've understood what a secondary sexual characteristic is, and everyone knew that they existed, even if they didn't know that term, then we're going to talk about what hormones cause that. So, we're talking about two kinds of hormones, and in all honesty, you probably know both of them already. Particularly the one for men. But we're going to start with women. So we're talking about estrogen. Now this word estrogen can be spelled two ways, one with an O and one without. Americans spell it without an O because they're not great with silent letters. We spell it with an O, so please do spell it with an O. That's how we spell it. So in women, the main hormone to control puberty is estrogen. Now, everything that then occurs to girls, breast development, all of that, anything that you can associate with puberty is caused by estrogen. And it's produced by the ovaries. So I'm going to talk a lot more about the ovaries and what they do in a second. And actually, in fact, we're going to talk a lot more about estrogen because it's got a key part in the menstrual cycle. But for now, we need to know that it's produced in the ovaries and it causes the changes during puberty. And on the right, you can see some of those changes. You do not need to copy all of that down, nor do you need to know the vast majority of it. But it does have enormous numbers of uses. So get down those notes if you haven't already. Now, the male hormone is testosterone. And again, you can see some effects down here, mostly to do with puberty, some not, mostly. So, again, this causes all of the changes that happen to boys as they go through puberty, and it also leads to the production of sperm. And it is found in the testes. It's made in the testes and transferred around the body. And again, it has wide-ranging effects. It affects most cells in your body. But the main effects are the ones you see during puberty. From increased strength and musculature, through hair growth, through increased sex drive, that kind of an idea. All of that's testosterone. It's worth noting that these hormones can cause other hormones to be activated. So it's not just testosterone and estrogen on their own, but those are the drivers, those are the key hormones. Again, get down those notes if you haven't already. Fine. So that's all we're going to say about puberty. Now, puberty, I've always viewed, you do need to know about it for GCSE. I've always viewed as a topic which is best left for Year 7. We did study it in Year 7, and I'm assuming that most people know most of the changes that happen during puberty. If there is any confusion there about what testosterone causes, about the different changes that occur during puberty, do contact your teacher. They'll be able to help you a lot with that. I don't want you to be left behind if you're confused by any of this. We're going to move on to the menstrual cycle, which needs a lot more careful learning because it's a lot more difficult. So let's spend some time on that. Now, hopefully everyone remembers from Year 7 what the menstrual cycle is. So the menstrual cycle is the cycle which involves an egg maturing and being released so that a woman is capable of having a baby. And then if that egg is not fertilized, it then goes on to be removed from the body. That's the whole point of the menstrual cycle. And as part of that, you have the period, or what we call menstruation, where the dead tissue from inside the uterus, and the egg, small amounts of blood, are released from the vagina. This is all the menstrual cycle. Now we're going to go through the stages in order, and you need to get them down as we're going along. I will pause very briefly at the end of each one, just so you can pause me in case you haven't got the notes down as I've been talking. So, firstly, number one, technically it's a cycle, so you can start anywhere. I'm going to start with an egg being released from the ovaries. Now this happens roughly once every 28 days. It is extremely important you understand that not every woman has a 28-day menstrual cycle. It can go a very wide range around that. But 28 days is kind of your dead average. Now ovulation in this kind of dead average cycle would happen on day 13 to 15. In fact, we tend to just say day 14 for ease. Again, if you don't have a 28-day cycle as a woman, it won't happen on day 14. It will happen about halfway through. So, 28 days we have ovulation. That's the first key term we need to know. That's what it's called when the egg is released. That's why that's in bold. And again, it happens on day 14. Fine, I'm going to move on to slide 2 now. Stage 2, once the egg's been released, it moves down the oviduct. As part of that, it has to be found along by cilia. This is the second time we've heard the term cilia in GCSE. I wonder whether you can think of what the other one is. And the answer is that it's found in the lungs as well, and in the trachea to after mucus up towards the top of your throat, so that any bacteria that are trapped in there can be swallowed down into your stomach acid. Here, though, the cilia are going to waft those eggs up the oviduct, and it's going to travel along towards the uterus. Now, eggs do not live very long. They only survive for about a day or two after ovulation. And if you think about it, that's the only time you can possibly get pregnant. As a woman, if your egg has been released, the egg has to have been released for it to get fertilized. Otherwise, if it's in the ovary, it can't get fertilized. Sperm can't get into the ovary, otherwise it'd be horrible. You'd have thousands of babies. But no, you have to wait for it to be released, and it has to be alive. So you've got that period between it being released and it being alive, it being dead, and that's about 24 hours to 48 hours. And it usually happens that it dies around 16 days into kind of an average cycle. Of course, and I keep repeating that is very changeable. Now, it takes sperm several days to move up that far into the fallopian tube that it can actually fertilise the egg. So actually, you have a couple have to have had sex days before the egg is released during ovulation in order for the couple to get pregnant. However, it's very important that you're careful here. It's completely unpredictable when the egg will be released. And actually, eggs can be released at really odd times. So a woman can get pregnant almost any time within that cycle. It's not a good way of predicting. It's certainly not a good method of contraception to just not have sex except on day 14 to 16. That doesn't work, because eggs are released at different times every month. It's quite unpredictable. The next thing we're going to look at is step 3. Now, this is happening for pretty much the entire menstrual cycle, from about day 7 to about day 28. So during the entire process we just talked about, with the egg being released and the sperm potentially fertilizing the egg potentially dying, we've got the uterus lining building itself up. Now this is absolutely essential for a fertilized egg, because what we need is for the uterus lining to have a large blood supply full of nutrients for the fertilized egg to grow in initially, because before the baby, the fetus, grows a placenta, it gets all of its nutrition directly from the womb lining. And so throughout the menstrual cycle, from about day 7 to about day 28, we're building up the lining. And this continues from about day 16, when the egg dies, all the way round to day 28. And as I say, it's just to provide nutrition for the embryo to implant itself in the uterus. We move on to stage 4. Now, we can't keep that lining there for all time. You might think, well, why don't we just maintain the lining as it is? Why do we keep growing new lining every month? And the reason is that just as it's a fantastic, great place for an embryo to grow, it's also a fantastic place for bacteria to grow. So if you maintain the lining and keep it there for the entire month, you're going to end up with bacterial infections happening quite regularly. Now, the vagina and cervix, they have plenty of defences against bacteria, but still, if the lining was there permanently, eventually a bacterium is going to get in, it's going to grow out of control, it's going to cause nasty infections. So we have to get rid of the lining every month in order to remove any bacteria that might be there and to prevent them growing. Now, that's called menstruation. It's often also known as a woman's period, and that's probably the term you've heard. Basically, it looks like a small amount of blood loss from the vagina, and that is just the uterus lining being released, along with the dead egg. And this is happening from about day 1 to day 7-ish, but again, that's completely variable between different women. It can be much shorter, it can be much longer than 7 days. Fine. Now, the task we're going to do to make sure you've got this, and that's kind of instead of writing extensive notes, is this task here. Now, this diagram will be in the assignment. It will be attached to the assignment you've got. What I need you to do is, if you're going to print it out, you can. If you've got a printer at home, I think that'd be useful. In which case, you should cut out all the different bits and then stick them in the right places. Or, if you're going to do this on the Word document, what you need to do is you need to get the little diagram I've got there, which is on the document you'll be provided with, put it on a Word document, and surround it with all the text boxes in the correct place. There's also a colouring task. It says to colour the different days for when, for instance, menstruation is happening. Now, the sheet is fairly straightforward and self-explanatory. I'm not going to mention it much longer than that. If you have any questions about the sheet, ask your teacher. If you're cutting this out, it'll take you about 10 minutes. If you're doing it on Word, I reckon it'll take you about 5 or 6 minutes. The colouring will be easier if you cut it out, but the cutting will take quite a long time, so it's up to you. So just pause me now if you haven't already. Fine. So hopefully, what you should find, if I just bring up that sheet, is you should have filled it in like this. You've got the colouring at the top, so the period is happening. You should be colouring in days 1 to 5 on this diagram. The egg is developing. Well, we haven't talked about that one much, but if we know it's released on day 14-ish, and we know that the old egg is lost between days 1 and 5, then the new egg must be developing between days 6 and 12. That's just logical. Then we come to the egg is released. Well, that's anywhere between day 13 and 15. You can just pick a day. 14 is your kind of standard set day. The uterus continues to get itself ready. Well, that is from about day 17 to 28. And the egg might be fertilized. You're looking at days 15 or 16. A couple of days after whenever you picked ovulation to happen. Fine. In terms of sticking the information in the right places, well, if I bring this up a little bit, you should have put between day 1 and 5 the uterus lining is shed. Well, that obviously goes between day 1 and 5. The egg dies if it is not fertilized. That'll be around day 16. Between day 13 and 15, an egg is released from one of the 2 ovaries. That's obviously between day 13 and 15. The egg travels down the fallopian tube. That will be anywhere between day, whatever day you picked for ovulation, between day 16 and 28, really. And then by day 27, the uterus lining starts to break down. That should be around day 27. And the lining of the uterus starts to grow and an egg ripens in the ovary. That's anywhere from days 6 to 12. Fine, so hopefully that's not too difficult. In terms of the questions, what triggers these changes? Well, that's hormones. Talk about them in a second. Where do these signals come from? Well, the ovaries, the egg, and the pituitary glands. Again, we'll talk about that in a second. Fine. So we get rid of this diagram and we will move on. Right. Menstrual cycle. The last thing we need to know about the menstrual cycle is about the hormones which control it. So we all know about what hormones are. We've done several hormones already, so I'm not going to dwell on that. There are 4 you need to know about: estrogen, progesterone, FSH, LH. And you need to know what each one does and where it's released from. Let's touch on estrogen and progesterone first. You've definitely heard of estrogen before, we talked about it earlier. It's what controls puberty in women. Progesterone you probably haven't come across before. Now, estrogen and progesterone are both released by the ovaries and also by the egg when it's been released. So, estrogen is responsible for building the uterus lining up. And you can see on my little graph down here that estrogen kind of bumps along the bottom. Then at ovulation, around ovulation, it starts to go up massively, and that's what starts the uterus lining really ramping up. And then it slowly just bumps along, and it drops suddenly as we start menstruation. Now you'll notice it's always present. That's because women have a constant supply of estrogen. It does lots of other things as well as building the uterus lining up. But when you want the uterus lining to really start ramping up, we're going to increase the levels of estrogen. So we don't need to know about the graph, it's just demonstrating it, but estrogen is responsible for building the uterus lining. You just need to know that fact. Progesterone does not build the lining, it maintains the lining. So you need them to work together. They're both released by the ovaries and then taken over by the egg. So we need estrogen to start the lining growing, we need progesterone to keep the lining there. If you don't have enough estrogen, that's quite rare for this example, but if you don't have enough estrogen, you just won't build the lining. More commonly, progesterone deficiency is a thing. You can't maintain the lining, so you can't keep the lining there. So you need both to be working together. Now, this is really useful, this system, because when the egg dies, it stops releasing those hormones, and that's what eventually causes the lining to be lost. If the egg doesn't die, because it's been fertilized by sperm, then you don't want the lining to be lost, and so the egg will keep on pumping out estrogen and progesterone. And this is how we keep the lining when you are having a fertilized egg when you're pregnant, because the egg will maintain the estrogen and progesterone levels to stop the lining being released. Right, two other hormones, FSH and LH. Again, we just need to know the facts of what they do, where they're released from. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. You don't need to know that name, but you may see that in a textbook. It causes a new egg to grow when the old one is dead. So once the old egg is dead, we release a whole high level of FSH, and that causes a new egg to develop. And then LH causes the egg to be released once it is ready. Now, this is called a luteinizing hormone. I like to think of it as leaving hormone. It makes the egg leave. Okay, so the egg sits in the ovary. There's loads of eggs in the ovary. Some FSH is released, and that causes one of the eggs to start to develop. And then eventually, once it's grown enough, about day 14, a load of luteinizing hormone, LH, leaving hormone, causes the egg to leave into the fallopian tube. There is a trick here, which I didn't mention in our TSH lesson. And the trick is, all hormones that are acronyms, all hormones that are abbreviations, are released by the pituitary gland. So that's TSH, FSH, and LH. So if you see a hormone and you're not sure whether it's released by the pituitary gland, is it an acronym? If it's not an acronym, it's not released by the pituitary gland. Now that is not a universal rule. That doesn't work for all hormones, but it does work for all the hormones that we need to know for GCSE. So on your exam, you can use that rule. When you get onto things like degree level biology, you can't use that rule anymore. But GCSE, if you see an acronym, it's the pituitary gland. Fine. So FSH and LH both released by the pituitary. Just add that onto your notes. Fine. Now, last little activity. Without looking back if you can you please write the names LH, FSH, estrogen, progesterone, and then write these statements next to the correct hormone. Okay. The only one you won't be able to do is blocks FSH. I'll come to that one later on, so leave that one. But pause me, spend a couple of minutes, just summarise basically what each one does and where it's released, and then we'll come to blocks FSH afterwards. Right, so builds uterus lining, you should have written that one next to estrogen. Causes egg release, LH. Makes eggs mature, FSH. Blocks, FSH, I'm going to come to in a second. Made by pituitary, LH and FSH. Made by ovaries and the egg too, estrogen and progesterone. Blocks FSH, that is estrogen and progesterone. And if you think about it, that's really useful. The egg releases estrogen and progesterone, and you only want one egg at a time. So if you've got an egg released into the fallopian tube, it is releasing estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone then block FSH. That stops another egg from developing. So you can only, usually, have one egg at a time released, because that egg will block FSH, because it's releasing estrogen and progesterone, so that no more eggs develop. So blocks FSH, estrogen and progesterone do that. We're going to come to that next week when we talk, next lesson, when we talk about contraception. It's going to be very important. Right. Oh, there's the answers. I should have put that on the board. Maybe your life easier. If you need the answers, they're there. Fine. Now, I'm actually going to leave those questions. I think that's quite straightforward. But this 6-mark exam question is important. I'd like you to have a go at this 6-mark exam question. And if you can, write it out in full. Most of them are only a few word answers anyway. So pause me, we'll go through the answers. So, what is a hormone? Well, the definition of a hormone is a chemical messenger, or a substance produced by a gland, or a substance transported to a target organ, or a substance that controls bodily functions. Now I have to say, this was a 3-mark question last year in the GCSE paper, and it was for saying that it was a chemical messenger produced by a gland that acts on a target organ. So actually, whilst this is a 1-mark question, it's worth knowing all the marks, because occasionally it's worth 3 marks, which is very nice, easy 3 marks if you know what the marks are for. Name an organ that produces a hormone. Well, you can literally name any gland, or you can just write the word gland. That's fine. How hormones transport their transport organs? In the blood. I would go in the plasma of the blood. The plasma transports everything except oxygen and carbon dioxide. And then lastly, describe how the hormones FSH, estrogen, LH are involved in the control of the menstrual cycle. It's basically asking what does each one do. So, FSH stimulates egg maturation and egg ripening. Forget estrogen production for now. I'm not going to cover that. That's more A-level biology. You could write it if you knew about it, but I wouldn't bother. So FSH stimulates egg maturation or egg ripening. Will get your mark. Estrogen inhibits FSH. You could say that. Or I would write estrogen builds up uterus lining. You get a mark for that. It's the main thing it does, so why not write it? It does block FSH as well. Great, but that's not the main thing it does. LH stimulates egg release. Now, the only place people are going to lose marks is they're a bit fussy. And I would have mentioned this earlier. It's one of the reasons why I like to go through this exam question is to kind of let you make a classic mistake. They're a bit fussy about their word for egg development. I would call it egg development. If I was talking to a normal person on the street and they said, what does FSH do? I would say it makes the new egg develop. I've probably said it several times today. They like the word mature. Makes the egg mature, or the egg ripen. Because they want you to know that it's not creating a whole new egg, because the eggs are already there. It's making them grow up, if you like. Mature is the word I would use. So FSH makes eggs mature, and that's fine. And that's quite recent. Until recently, they were quite happy with develop. They've become a bit more fussy recently. Fine. So hopefully everybody's understood all those points. There's nothing else to say about menstrual cycle. For today, you need to know what the menstrual cycle is and the hormones that control it and the days on which different things happen. So basically know your diagram and know what each hormone does. Might be worth going back and adding the hormones to the diagram, writing down when you think they'll be used, but entirely up to you. And also for puberty, you just need to know the kinds of changes that happen during puberty, what a secondary sexual characteristic is, and the hormones that cause it. I hope that's been useful to you. I hope you have a very good day, and I will no doubt see some of you in the hopefully the not too distant future.